Well, hello everybody, my name's Louise Savage. A very warm welcome back to my channel if you're revisiting, and an equally warm welcome if you are visiting for the very first time. So it is now July, but only the beginning of July, and that means we're more than 6 months through the year, so halfway through. And I set myself a target on Storygraph, the app that I use to keep track of my reading this year, that I was going to try and read 100 books, which seemed like an absolutely ridiculous challenge. So I've decided to pause and make this video now because I know that more than 6 months have gone, but I've got to the point where I've read 50 books. So it seemed to me like the halfway point in my reading experience of the year, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I can't believe how much I've read. I've read more in the last 6 months than I think probably at any other time in my life, even when I was a child and I was reading avidly. And I think that's because, dare I say, I've retired. And yeah, it's just an absolute joy, and I've read some real corkers. So at this point, to sort of sit back and reflect on the things that have really stuck with me and that I think will be with me forever is really interesting, because there are some books you read, you really enjoy, but they sort of disappear off into the sidelines somewhere. But these are all corkers, and I've chosen fiction. I might have a reflection on my favourite non-fiction so far this year, but I'm worried that if I do, that might be very women's prize skewed. Not that that matters, but that I'm kind of retracing my steps. But I need to actually have a look. I haven't sort of specifically looked at the non-fiction that I've read yet, so it might be quite interesting to see how that's panned out. So the first book that I'm going to talk about, and these are not in the order in which I read them, or at least if they are, that's coincidental, but I don't think they are. They're more in a kind of reverse order of from sort of, well, I don't know. I'm trying to do them in an order of which stayed with me the most, so I'm going from sort of least to most, and I've only chosen 6 books, one for each month of the year. Maybe I should have chosen 5, I don't know, 5 out of 50, but I've chosen 6. And the first one, actually, I think is one of the first books I read. It might even have been the first book I read this year, and it's Thin Air by Michelle Paver. Now, I know I've talked about this on my channel before, and actually this year I've been doing a book of the month, and I think quite a lot of these, not all of them, but quite a lot of these have featured as my book of the month as well. So I'm hopefully not going to waffle on for too long about each of these books today. So if you want to find out more about them, that might be a place to go, I don't know. But this book has really, really stayed with me. And I think it's because it's an adventure story. It's set in the Himalayas. And I still feel like I'm climbing the mountain in this novel with the explorers who are venturing into it. And I just love the way that Michelle Paver has set a ghost story in that environment. And I'm not a ghost story fan, but it has haunted me. And I do go back and think about it, and it's partly the fact that I don't think I'll ever climb anything like that myself now. So the book has kind of given me an insight into what that experience feels like, because Michelle Paver's writing about nature and environment particularly, I've always found exquisite. She seems to be able to really sort of conjure up an atmosphere and a place beautifully. But I was reflecting about this just before I started recording, and I think one of the reasons that this book has lingered with me so long, and I've just had all my siblings to stay this weekend, so I don't know what this says, is that it's a book about sibling rivalry. And I think that rivalry is portrayed, and also to a degree class rivalry as well. It's definitely a kind of social class element to this book. So I think that the sort of the idea of sibling rivalry has the way that she describes it, and the impact it has on the 2 main characters, who simply, I say simply, set off to climb a mountain together, and they are brothers, has really lasted with me. So definitely Thin Air is, I think, will be one of my favourite books of the year still by the end of the year. But it's hard to predict, isn't it? Because I don't know what I'm going to read. And then next up, was a book that I came across because of the Women's Prize. So I didn't read the long list for non-fiction in its entirety this year, but I did read Ordinary Human Failings simply because I happened to have it, which is a bit of an admission, isn't it? But there we are, by Megan Nolan, and I was absolutely bowled away by it. Again, it's a book that looks at class. It looks at an Irish family who've come to London to kind of escape something that's happened to one of the family members while they were in Ireland. I don't want to give away any spoilers. And also, they're a family that have all sorts of problems. One of them struggles with alcohol addiction, and a young girl is murdered on the estate where they're living, or the block of flats, the tenements where they're living, and the daughter of one of the characters is only 10, and she's accused of the murder. So it's kind of sold as a thriller, really, I suppose, and that's not quite right. I mean, I love a thriller, don't get me wrong, but I think this book is so much more than that. I think it's a real exploration of the way that society views these families who are struggling financially, struggling with, battling addiction, all those kind of things. And I think that the real sort of strength of this novel for me, and the way that it's lingered with me, is because Megan Nolan writes about this family who are very flawed, with real empathy and real understanding. And I think she's kind of championing a class of people that is rarely talked about, rarely focused on, and certainly rarely understood. So I really admired her for doing that. The other thing that I really loved about this book was that there is a journalist involved. Of course, the media want to make a story out of this. So you've got a young journalist who's very, very hungry to sort of break an original story, and he just happens to be on that patch at the time when the girl initially disappears and then is found dead. And it's just the description of the way the family are whisked away, put in a hotel, supplied with alcohol, in the hope that they'll spill the beans and release some tale to this journalist. I think it really exposes the sinister side of the way that the tabloid press, certainly in the UK, and I suspect other parts of the globe as well, operate. So I thought it had a lot to say about that. I think this is really quite an important book, actually, the more I think about it. So really, really, I know, again, this book is going to stay with me. And then the third one that I chose out of my 6 is Glorious Exploits by Ferdia, Lennon. And I can't think about this book without smiling. It's just so quirky and so unusual. I think it's a highly, highly, highly original novel. It plays into my love of the ancient world because it's set on Sicily during the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC. And it's it's a story of horror in many, many ways, because it looks at the way that the Athenians, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Athenians have been captured, taken captive by the Syracusans, and are being kept in the most horrific conditions in this quarry. And these two young, particularly one of them is a real chancer, these two young men, they're not so young actually, they decide that they're going to put on a production of Medea, an ancient Greek tragedy, and they're going to do it in the quarries, and they're going to have the slaves as characters. And this is a novel that is so much about friendship. It's about hope. It's about enthusiasm. It looks at the way that literature can try to change things, that it's something to turn to. Great writing can be something to turn to in a crisis. And the characters and their escapades have really, really stayed with me. And it's a few months now since I read it. I just think it's joyful, but it's also, I suppose it's very human, That's what I would say about it. Is it's a really, really human story, and I love the way Ferdia Lennon riffs around attitudes towards ancient Greek culture and ancient history and so on. So I just thought I did think it was glorious. Pardon me, I've had a bit of a cold this week. And next up is another book that has a classical background to it, because this is Colm Tóibín's House of Names, and it's the first one of his novels that I've read, to my shame. I need to get on to Brooklyn because the sequel's come out recently, hasn't it? And oh my goodness, this book, I think the writing is utterly stunning, and he retells the story of the myth cycle of the House of Atreus, so from ancient Greece. So it's the story of Agamemnon, who is the leader of the Greek army when they go off to fight the Trojan War for 10 years. But before he leaves, he needs to, the gods tell him to sacrifice his daughter in order to allow the wind to fill the sails so the ships can sail across to Greece. And in this, what Colm Tóibín does so cleverly is he turns this into a much more sort of family. I mean, it is a family drama, but he kind of removes the gods. The gods are sort of sidelined in this version, which I thought was a really interesting thing to do. And so it looks at the situation as a truly human dilemma, and he exploits gaps in our knowledge of mythology to look at, for example, the character of Orestes, who is Agamemnon's son, and Orestes' need and drive to avenge what his father has done, and equally, ultimately, what his mother goes on to do. So it's gritty. It's a really gritty, raw, beautifully written novel that would be an interesting insight for anybody who's not familiar with the classical world. I don't think you need to know anything about classical mythology to enjoy this. And it looks at the way that these myths are doing so much more than just talking about the workings of the gods. You know, I really think that myth is a way of looking at human behaviour and human interaction, and particularly, you know, how should you deal with this situation as a family? How should you deal with that situation as a family? But the landscape in this is so important as well. It's very rugged, it's very raw. I suppose it's very Irish. You know, when I was reading this, I think in my head, yes, I was in Greece, and there are parallels. Whenever I've been to Ireland, I've always felt, you know, the pace of life, the harshness of the landscape, the and absolute beauty of the landscape. You know, very similar. They provoke very similar emotions in me. I feel equally at home and in awe in both of those places, and I think that comes through in this novel. Anyway, I just thought it was, as you can tell, absolutely wonderful. And then Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshananthan, and this was the book that won the Women's Prize for Fiction this year. And this book, I think, will probably be one of my all-time favourite ever books. That's a mouthful, isn't it? When I read it, I couldn't believe that it wasn't a memoir. I couldn't believe that V.V. hadn't grown up in Sri Lanka. So it's the story. It tells the story of the Sri Lankan civil war. It tells it from the perspective of a family who are Tamil, and the young girl in the story who's the protagonist. She is very hardworking. She's training to be a doctor. The civil war breaks out. Something awful happens to one of her brothers, and her other brothers respond in different ways. She's got 3 other brothers, and they each respond. 2 of them respond in one way and one in another. Don't want to spoil it, to the civil war. But what I think is brilliant about this book is it shows that nobody wins in this situation, And it shows the absolute dilemma of which way to turn. Where should your loyalties lie? Should they lie with your family? Should they lie with your political leanings? Should they lie with your tribe? You know, where do you turn when your whole world is sort of erupts into violence? And it really explores, I've forgotten her name, is it, I want to say Sashi, I think it's Sashi, but it really explores the difficulties that she has in terms of sort of doing the right thing and showing loyalty to the people that she respects and admires. There's a very interesting relationship in here with her and her professor, a female professor who she really sort of looks up to and admires. And I also think this book has got a fantastic take on terrorism. It sort of normalizes it, and it explains it away. It makes it easier to empathize and understand with people's decisions, and predominantly male decisions, to become terrorists. You can really see how that naturally evolves out of a situation like this in this book. I felt that this was a really didactic book in the best sense of the word. I learned so much about Tamil culture, about Sri Lanka, about you know, about that period in history. I felt like I came away from it really well educated, but nothing was rammed down my throat. You know, I was following this very well plotted, very driven narrative. So yeah, really, really important book, I think. And finally, and if you've been watching my my videos this year, I think you might know what I'm holding in my hand here. I'll just give you a moment so you can predict it if you want to. It is Prophet Song by Lynch. I felt such a fool for not coming to this sooner. I don't know why. But I think this is an absolute masterpiece. And I am going to do a video about what might make a perfect novel, because I think it's a really, really interesting discussion. There are some people who think there's no such thing, but I'm actually not so sure about that. And for me, this novel is flawless. It's dystopian. It looks at how it's set in Ireland in the current moment, and it looks at how society can suddenly, at the flick of a switch almost, come under totalitarian control. And what is absolute genius about it is that it explores the situation through the eyes of a mother of 4 children, and one of whom's a baby, one of whom's a 16-year-old. So you've got a whole span there of experience. She also has an elderly father who's suffering from memory loss due to age, and you know, she's completely trapped. Her husband is taken away by the police at the very start of the novel, so there's no spoilers there, and she is left to deal with this absolutely hideous, I was going to say horrendous, there's no such word, hideous situation. And she's really resourceful. You know, she's a scientist. She's got a really practical brain. It looks at her experience in the workplace. It looks at her experience in the home, and it's devastating, and it's beautifully written. And the sense of creep in this novel, in terms of things just getting darker and darker and darker, it's pace perfect, the way that is done. And I will never get over reading this. I don't think it had such a profound impact on me. And I think the last 3 novels I've mentioned are certainly not for the faint-hearted. All of them, I think, have some very disturbing moments in them. For me, I think that's really important in literature. I think one of the things that literature allows you to do is to be taken to places that, you know, hopefully you will never visit. and to experience things that hopefully you will never experience, but generates the empathy and the interest to be supportive of people who do have these awful things to deal with. I mean, this is a book that sort of makes sense of Ukraine, or it makes sense of, you know, the Palestinian situation at the moment, the Israel Gaza. It makes sense of all that kind of stuff, but it would also equally make sense. It kind of helps you to understand what happened in Hitler's Germany. You know, and to reflect that there, but for the grace of God, it's one of those novels, and I just loved it. So I think I've had a pretty corking 6 months of reading. I think my first 50 books have thrown up some absolutely beautiful novels, and I can only look forward to what the next 6 months have been. So yeah, please share your favourite, your top 6 or your top novel that you've enjoyed so far this year, and happy reading, everybody, for the next 6 months. And we'll be reflecting on, or I'll be reflecting on this again, hopefully along with you lot as well, in, I was going to say September, not September, December, end of. That's when, you know, I'll be thinking about this again. Anyway, take care. So for now, bye.